It's an ugly past that we will need to come to terms with. I don't think we will ever be able to come to terms with what has happened. There are other stories of atrocities in the world, but I think that the enslavement of Africans is one of the most inhumane and ugly stories of this world.
Welcome to Whispers of the Past. I'm your host, Fee DeWitt. In this episode, we begin a chapter that's deeply painful, but profoundly important. As we open the story of Sint Eustatius' role in the transatlantic and slave trade, we recognize that these stories are not just dates or distant events. They are stories of real people, of lives uprooted, of resilience being tested, and of a brutal system that denied freedom and dignity to generations. This journey into the early colonial years of Sint Eustatius from 1600 to 1650 is not just one we take lightly. We approach it with respect and a solemn commitment to tell these truths as clearly as we can. Understanding that the facts and figures cannot capture the full weight of what enslaved people endured. Yet, recounting this story with honesty and reverence, we hope to create a bridge to deeper awareness and understanding. We hope to honor their legacy by giving voice to a history too often silenced and too often sanitized. In this episode, Finders Keepers, we look at the early colonial years, a time when empires extended their reach into the Caribbean. As they established plantations, they imposed systems that sought to exploit human lives for profit, forever altering societies and legacies. This journey begins in the 1600s, and through the insights of historian Dr. Allain, we seek to understand the stark realities of these early years of enslavement, including the tragic burdens faced by enslaved women.
1600 to 1650. For the majority of the history of the Atlantic slave trade, most captives purchased by European buyers for sale in the Americas were men, not women. But in the 17th century, the proportion of women who made up enslaved captives was higher than it would later become. Still, women remained in the minority among enslaved people in most Caribbean slave societies, well into the later decades of slavery. And I mention this demographic fact because it speaks to something really important about Atlantic slavery, which is that in most Caribbean slave societies, for the majority of the duration of slavery, slaveholders were not really all that interested in slave reproduction. Infant mortality rates were extremely high, and so were maternal mortality rates. So you had a situation in which relatively few women were giving birth to relatively few children. And to replenish the population of enslaved people, slaveholders opted to simply buy new captives from Africa because this was more cost effective. And knowing this, we can see how catastrophically brutal Caribbean slavery was on the bodies and lives of enslaved people. So that's really the first important fact to note about that period. 1600 to 1650 is when these plantation economies are just really getting off the ground in the Caribbean.
As Dr. Allain explains, the relentless demand for labor drove European settlers to turn towards African enslavement. This demographic choice placed a unique brutal strain on enslaved women that was different to enslaved men. Women were being exploited, not only as laborers, but eventually as reproductive vessels to sustain the enslaved population. Dr. Anishanslin explains on how indigenous labor initially played a role in this period, before European settlers solidified the institution of African enslavement.
There is this interesting gap period in St. Eustatius that did allow some of the indigenous people to relocate who wanted to, which raises some interesting questions about whether that put indigenous people in a better or a worse place vis-a-vis European settlement is unclear. But what I can say as someone who has studied the history of empires in this situation is that it means that the Europeans first begin settling. So first the French with their fort and then the Dutch. They do have indigenous laborers and enslave indigenous people, but pretty quickly they turn to systems of slavery, of African slavery in particular, to fuel the labor that they are going to use for the islands, to settle the islands and to really try to grow the cash crops, right? The things like tobacco and sugar that are going to make them money. And to sustain any population, you need women, right? There's a reason that armies have camp followers, and you don't just have, in the 17th century, a bunch of men going anywhere without some women involved who are going to be there to help to do things like laundry and cook. And in the case of settling a society, you need to reproduce your population. You need to have children who will increase European settlement if you are a slaveholder. And so in an island like St. Eustatius, where by the time European settlers really dig down and make a permanent go at it, one of the ways in which they increase the population is through enslaved people. One of the really pernicious things about the Atlantic slave trade is that it developed a very race-based slavery that attached a condition of servitude to, in many places, the condition of the mother, right? So if the mother was enslaved, then the baby would be enslaved automatically as well, regardless of who the father was. For enslaved women in particular, this creates this horrible situation where giving birth is adding to the fuel of the slave fire, right? And you are, by giving birth and procreating and extending your family, you are also adding to the profit of your enslaver.
As Dr. Anishanslin highlights, enslaved women bore the unique burden of both labor and forced reproduction, a painful reality that contributed to the economic machinery of slaveholding societies. But this shift in labor reliance also sparked competition among European powers, as they vied for control of strategic islands like Sint Eustatius. We now turn to the island's heritage inspector and historian, Mr. Richardson, who begins to recount the story of how Sint Eustatius became this pawn in this game European countries were super eager to claim.
So we do know that the island, of course, was officially colonized by Christopher Columbus. So the island was a Spanish possession. That's how it started, like many Caribbean islands. Even though the Spanish did not build one fort here or set foot, it was Spanish. It was theirs. So finders keepers.
With Spain's early claim, a pattern was established, one where European powers asserted ownership over territories with little regard for existing communities. But Spain's hold on Statia was brief. As other empires soon sought control, Mrs. Soutekouw, long-term resident of Sint Eustatius and one of the founders of the island's Archaeological Center of Research, explains how the English and then the French made early attempts to establish their presence here.
The English came in here evidently in the early 1620s, but actually did not stay and decided that they did not want to colonize the island. In 1626, the French came in. They started a colony. Primarily at that point in time, they were really looking for a place to establish a colony that was out of the way and away from the Spanish who were raiding through these islands. They did start the Bay Path. They did build some houses in Upper Town, and they built a wooden fort at the site of Fort Aranya.
Each European power left its mark on Statia's landscape, but it was the Dutch who ultimately solidified their presence here on Sint Eustatius. Mr. Richardson describes how the Dutch established a permanent foothold, setting the stage for a complex history of commerce and colonization.
The French built a very small fort on the cliff edge. And after some time, it is abandoned. And around 36, the Dutch come in and they enlarge the old wooden fort that was built by the French. And then they officially colonized the island on behalf of the WIC, so the West Indian Trading Company. And then they start to set up and what the WIC was known, for example, for its trade in sugar, salt, and of course in people. One of the first enslaved people that they bring in, of course, are the indigenous or the red slaves, and they prove to be not strong enough. The island starts to establish itself, and quite quickly, the island already starts to change hands. So you would see that it would not remain Dutch. And in the span of 150 years only, which is not quite long, you would see that after 1636, the island will change hands about 22 times, which is quite intense.
Eustatius' natural harbor made it an attractive port for trade, a key feature that the Dutch were quick to leverage. Under Dutch control, Sint Eustatius became a key point in the vast and brutal web of Caribbean trade. A trade that did not just involve goods, but human lives. This tiny island, nestled in the Caribbean, served as a transit hub where enslaved people were torn from their homelands, forced across the ocean, and reshaped into commodities for profit. This weight of this history is undeniable, and Mr. Richardson helps us uncover how Eustatius' role in this tragic system was established. A place where the horrors of the Middle Passage met the cruel reality of the life in the Caribbean.
What I do know from one of the records from the WIC, but also in the Zeeland archives, is that the Dutch started trading in enslaved people quite early. They started already before they came to the Dutch Caribbean in New York. One of the first exchange between African slaves and colonists was done by the Dutch as early in New York. And one of the first things that you see also that when you go to the early records of the establishment of Fort Amsterdam, there's already a document of enslaved people being brought in 1640 to the island at Fort Amsterdam. And that's what we call the water fort behind the smoke alley. And the amount that's brought in the first time is already 50 enslaved people directly from Elmina. And the Dutch kind of quickly set up this kind of trading post. It's all about trade and the trade after Africa, which is that before they go into the real kind of establishing a plantation economy, they go into trading. And then you see St. Eustatius becoming this tussenstop, this kind of in-between stop before Suriname and Curaçao. And the first place where the ships were coming from Elmina was actually to St. Eustatius. And then from St. Eustatius, you would have then be resold and replaced in new groups and then be sold into the other islands or other countries.
As the Dutch solidified their control over Sint Eustatius, the island became a devastating crossroad in the transatlantic enslaved trade. A pivotal transit point where countless African men, women, and children were forcibly bought, sold, and dispersed throughout the Caribbean. This transformation turned Sint Eustatius into a central hub for this inhumane commerce of human lives, embedding the island deeply into the tragic history of slavery. Within this system, enslaved women faced a uniquely multifaceted exploitation. Beyond the grueling physical labor imposed upon them, they were coerced into reproductive exploitation, forced to bear children to perpetuate the enslaved workforce. This practice, often being referred to as quote-unquote slave breeding, stripped women of their humanity, reducing them to mere instrument for economic gain. As historian Deborah Gray White notes in her book Aren't I a Woman?, she mentions that enslaved women were valued not just for their labor, but also for their ability to reproduce future labors, a cruel commodification of their very bodies and their very existence. The dual exploitation of enslaved women inflicted profound physical and psychological trauma, illustrating the systematic brutality of slavery. The dark chapters of enslavement started to etch into Sint Eustatius' history. This demands reflection and acknowledgement. To understand these systems of oppression and how they unfolded on the island, Mr. Richardson continues as we turn to the mechanisms that supported this trade and the stories of those who endured it.
The trade in women was, first of all, let me go back to how it started in Africa. I think one of the interesting things that I was told when I visited Ghana a few years ago was the guide at Elmina told me the Europeans, they weren't taking the meek, they weren't taking the ill they weren't taking the old. They were taking the strong, the healthy, the warriors, the kings, the queens, because no king, no African king or prince or chief facing rifles and muskets would allow his people to be shot. So sometimes out of giving in, just to protect your people, many of these chiefs and everyone were being taken across the ocean into enslavement. So that also shows you the kind of type of people that you would have been getting into the Caribbean as well. And that's also one of the interesting things, what you see when it comes to uprising. You should always ask yourself, where are the uprisings in Africa? They all started to happen in the Caribbean. That strong willingness, of course. And eventually the colonization of Africa was so easy because of that, what we would have called now the brain drain. That was already happening. All of those people were being taken out and put into the New World in the Caribbean on the plantations. So when you look at the women, for example, women weren't treated as women. You were just basically a commodity. You were a property. So you were dehumanized in the most extensive way that you could. And we also remember people like Sarah Bartman, for example, how she traveled as a circus act. And the same happened to women that came here on Sint Eustatius. Women were treated as breeders. One of their main jobs were not only working the fields, but also to produce healthy Negro enslaved children to be sold off again, basically like cattle. And that narrative was also definitely the case here on our islands as well. And that is the norm of how enslaved women were treated. But that doesn't mean that there weren't ever any resistance. Because we do know, for example, that in the late 1600s, early 1700s, there's an uprising again at Fort Amsterdam, and that's because two African groups were brought across the ocean and they are seen as docile and quiet. And then when they came to shore at Fort Amsterdam, all hell broke loose. And you see often many times in the earlier century that many uprisings were actually being led by women first. And then, of course, men also had their share. But many uprisings on many other islands, women also took the lead.
Amid the systematic brutality of enslavement, a small yet potent symbol of enslavement appeared. Despite its simplicity, it carries deep meaning for the people who were stripped of their freedom. One such symbol on Sint Eustatius is the blue bead. These beads, initially crafted in Amsterdam as a tool of commerce, were destined to play a haunting role in the transatlantic slave trade. Being used as currency in the purchase and exploitation of human lives, their journey mirrored the harrowing path of those they were used to oppress. Over time, however, the blue beads came to mean something more. For the enslaved, they became markers of identity, wealth, and even hope. Passed from hand to hand, worn as adornments, these beads wove themselves into the fabric of the life on Statia. Some stories even suggest that they held the power to redefine bonds of kinship and love, allowing an enslaved man to claim his wife and protect her from being sold away. From their origins in the European factories to their use as both currency and cultural artifacts, these beads carry with them the weight and the complexity of this history. Mrs. Soutekouw introduces us to these iconic beads, which stories we will touch upon in upcoming episodes. But for now, we begin by unraveling their mystery and revealing how such a small object became an enduring emblem of both oppression and defiance.
The blue beads were actually made in Amsterdam by a man by the name of S-O-O-P. And they were made from the 1630s to the 1720s. And they were made, instead of using sand as the main substance of glass, they were using pot ash, which is the ashes left over after coal fire. And if you look up the charter that he got for manufacturing, it was for beads and other trinkets for trade to the savage. It's a very different world back then. We thought everybody that wasn't European and white were savage. But he was making mirrors and other things too, not just the blue beads. Originally, the blue beads were used for trade, by the Dutch East and West Indian Company, but primarily by the Dutch West Indian. They were used for buying slaves in Africa. They were then used here later on, after that trade was decreased, to pay the slaves for their work in the fields or in the houses or wherever. So they were used as a form of currency by the slaves who were not using monetary currency because it had no value to them. Whereas the beads they could wear and show their wealth with. The story is that a slave man could buy his wife from the master so that he owned her and not the master, so she couldn't be sold away if he had enough beads to go around her waist. So they wanted enough beads to go around the waist of the women they wanted to marry. In that way, she could not be sold away from.
As we conclude this chapter from 1600 to 1650, we are left with an overwhelming sense of heartbreak and reflection. This was the beginning of Sint Eustatius as it emerged as a pivotal crossroad in the transatlantic and slave trade. A place where ships carried not only goods, but also human lives that were torn from their homes. The unimaginable suffering endured by countless individuals reminds us of humanity's darkest capabilities, where profit and power eclipse the value of a human soul. Yet, within these narratives of pain, there are glimpses of defiance and survival, which slowly are starting to emerge. And they were often led by women, whose strength bore the weight of a system designed to break them. There are stories that are too often erased from colonial narratives, speak of resilience in the face of relentless oppression. From uprisings that dared to challenge the chains of enslavement to the mysterious blue bead, the blue bead that was witness to both suffering and resistance. These stories demand that we listen, that we bear witness with humility and honor. As we move forward on this journey, we leave behind this painful beginning, and we step into the next era, spanning from 1650 to 1700, a time when Sint Eustatius' strategic significance grew and its role in the Caribbean economy deepened. What will we uncover as the island story continues to unfold? Unfortunately, in our timeline, we are only at the beginning of these crimes. As we acknowledge the unthinkable suffering inflicted by human hands, let us confront the realities of this dark past with unwavering honesty. These cruelties were not inflicted by another species, but by humans against their own. This is a stark reminder that the crimes against humanity demands our collective reflection, accountability, and action. It is only by understanding the depths of these inhumane acts that we can truly work towards a world where such acts of cruelty are not only remembered, but also never repeated. Let us carry the lessons of this era with humility and reverence, honoring the resilience and humanity of those whose stories we tell. May we all commit ourselves to remembering these truths, not as a distant history, but as a call to actively be the change we wish to see.